back to episode 20 of the Bible Connection podcast. So this is a weekly podcast that follows our church's Bible reading plan that we might encourage you not to give up on reading your Bibles this year. So I'm your host, Josh Williams, and with me are some of my good friends, John Steinke.
Hey there.
Taylor Babcock.
Hello.
And a special guest with us tonight, Dr. Alan Price.
Hello, good evening.
Good to have you with us. So this week, we are discussing the Book of Ezra. So let's just hop right into it. All right, originally, the Book of Ezra and Nehemiah were one text that were only separated due to the length of scrolls. Yet there are actually three key leaders that can break up the text of Ezra and Nehemiah. So we got Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So who is Zerubbabel, and what happened under his leadership in Ezra chapters 1 through 6?
So Zerubbabel is the first of the three key leaders to leave Babylon for the reconstruction of Jerusalem in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. He is a descendant of David, and he's actually identified by the prophet Haggai as the governor of Judah after the exile. His name literally means planted in Babylon, so he's with the people who were born in that captivity in Babylon. And he is the one from chapters 1 through 6 who focuses on reconstructing the temple.
If you remember back to the end of 2 Chronicles, we saw that the last verse in 2 Chronicles says that Cyrus, king of Persia, spoke to the people and said, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He's charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up." And it kind of ends on like a fractured sentence. Well, Ezra begins finishing that thought, saying, "Up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord. Let each survivor in whatever place he sojourns be assisted by men of his place with silver and gold." And so Ezra starts to tell the story of which men actually physically did go up to Jerusalem. And so we have Zerubbabel, like Taylor mentioned, the one who's responsible for leading the first wave of exiles to rebuild the temple. And the important part of this person is that he's trying to make sure that if you remember in Chronicles, we talked about how right worship in the right place needs to take place. He's rebuilding the temple so that worship can continue. The people are being brought back out of exile, and he's going to be leading the people in this construction effort. But some interesting things about him, I know Dr. Price was mentioning before we started the podcast, he's often forgotten. This guy's got an entire book of the Bible written to him. Him and the priest with him, Jeshua. That's who the Book of Haggai is addressed to. So if you go to Haggai, you'll see at the beginning it says, I can just turn there really quickly. I bookmarked it. "In the 2nd year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, on the 1st day, the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak." And so he's not only a guy who's got 6 chapters of the Bible telling his story and charged with rebuilding the temple, but he's also got an entire book of the Bible written to encourage him and to kind of edify him in all of this. So he's a really significant person in the text.
And I would just add that I think he is often forgotten because Ezra and Nehemiah both have a book named after them. And so they get more of the attention in this whole plot line than Zerubbabel. And I guess most people probably don't even know that name. And yet his task of rebuilding the temple was certainly as significant, if not much more so, than Nehemiah's building the wall.
All right, so in chapter 4 of Ezra, adversaries oppose the rebuilding of the temple, and temporarily they put a halt to its construction. So what was happening there, and how was it resolved?
So the text kind of reads dramatically. It's not really too confusing what kind of attacks are happening. I mean, they try to bribe, they try to bully them into stopping. They write a letter to the king, lying to the king about their efforts so that their efforts will get shut down. I think one of the things that's really amazing to take away and really encourages me in my faith is that when they're encouraged not to build the temple because of all of the difficulties coming their way from these adversaries, the prophets of God, Zechariah and Haggai, again, books of the Bible named after them, so they're pretty familiar. In chapter 5, verse 1, they stand up and they encourage the people to continue their work. And another letter is written that kind of gives more of the full story and talks about the permission that was originally given and what they're doing with their effort. And it's rewarded their faithfulness in constructing the temple, even though they could be, persecuted for doing so, it's rewarded by what Darius decrees in his response. He says, "Now therefore," chapter 6, verse 6, "Tattenai, governor of province beyond the river," verse 7, "let the work on this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders rebuild his house on this site. Moreover, I make a decree what you should do for these elders in rebuilding the house of God. The cost is to be paid to these men in full without delay." And he goes even further to kind of enact a punishment or even a curse on anyone who would stop the construction of the temple, saying that the beams will be ripped from their house and they'll be impaled with them if they ever try to stop the construction or destroy this temple. And so their faithfulness in times of trouble is rewarded by God by moving and stirring the hearts of the king. I'm reminded of how it says in Proverbs that the hearts of the kings are like channels of water that the Lord directs.
Okay, moving on. In chapters 7 through 10 of Ezra, Ezra himself, he leads a group of exiles back to the land of Judah. So who is Ezra, and what happened under his leadership?
So Ezra is the appointed priest and scribe of Israel at the time of the reconstruction of the walls of Jerusalem. So he is about 60 years after Zerubbabel and the reconstruction of the temple. So this is a little bit later. We see that in his life, one of the things that he focuses on, or the thing he focuses on, is worship from the heart and practicing worship wholeheartedly as God has laid out in the law of Moses.
And I think the time period is very important because we forget about that. We read a book of the Bible, we just go from one chapter to the next and don't realize that you're right. From between chapters 6 and 7, I believe that's right, when Ezra comes on the scene, there has been that 60 plus years have transpired, but we tend to read it like, oh, it's just the next day or the next week. And so I think that's helpful that we know the historical time frame. So Ezra's going to lead spiritual revival in essence. Zerubbabel's going to rebuild the temple, Nehemiah is going to rebuild the walls, but Ezra's going to uphold the law and teach it and lead a revival. And there's some great verses in this section. John mentioned one earlier before we came on, chapter 7 and verse 10. For Ezra set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to do it, and to teach the statutes and rules in Israel. And then on into chapter 8 and following, there's some more on that, and even into Nehemiah as well, about how he taught the law, how he upheld it, and therefore there was some change. It turns out to be temporary, but there was some change in people's hearts for a while.
Two things that I think are interesting about Ezra as he's beginning his attempt of this, going back into the land to teach the Torah, to teach the law that he set his heart on. First is that he insists upon having good leadership if he's going to try to rebuild this community. It says in verse 13 of chapter 7 that the king of Persia made a decree of anyone who wants to freely offer to go to Jerusalem, they may go with you. And he also gives Ezra kind of the authority to make this all happen. He says in verse 25, "And you, Ezra, according to the wisdom of your God that's in your hand, appoint magistrates and judges who may judge all the people." Well, when he takes a genealogy in chapter 8, he notices that there are no Levites that have come with him. And if he's going to reestablish right worship in Jerusalem, that's not going to work. So he has to stop in verse 15 of chapter 8 and gather Levites to him with this newfound authority so that he can call up godly men who are ready to come in and teach the law and be examples in this new community. One thing that I find really funny as I'm reading, he's bragging to the king of Persia, I think rightly bragging, it's not in arrogantly, that God is going to make sure that everything goes well for his people. And then he finds himself in a tough position. I just want to read verse 21 of chapter 8. "I proclaimed a fast there at the river that we might humble ourselves before our God to seek a safe journey for us, ourselves and all of our goods. For I was ashamed to ask the king for a band of soldiers and horsemen to protect us on our way, since we'd told the king, the hand of our God is good on all those who seek him, and the power of his wrath is against all those who forsake him." So he puts himself in this position where in trying to honor God's name and praise God's name, rightfully so, now he's scared because he didn't bring any soldiers to protect him. And so his response is humility and prayer and it just seems it's one of those parts of Ezra and Nehemiah that just seems so much more livable than some of the lists and genealogies that we've been dealing with lately in the texts.
And that's really one of the themes of both of the books is the providence of God, how God is orchestrating all this. Even in the book of Esther, where God's name is not mentioned, God is still in charge of everything going on there. And it's a recurring theme in these books, mentioned multiple times. I have some reference, but we'll save that for next week on Nehemiah. But both of these men, Nehemiah and Ezra, repeatedly acknowledge that God is in control of what's going on.
And I want to back up a little bit and kind of look at a high level. So when you read from chapter to chapter, sometimes the time frames can be overlooked. But when we're reading through all the different lineages of the kings, there's a really long period in which they are idolatrous, in which they are worshiping other gods. They're not keeping Sabbath. So when they're in Babylon and they're deported, it says that they're there for a period of 70 years. That's the amount of time in which they should have been keeping Sabbath. So there was, I think, a 490-year period in which they were idolatrous in the land and they were not keeping Sabbath. So God got his Sabbath, and by deporting them to Babylon, there was this 70-year period of rest in which fulfills what the prophet Jeremiah said. So in looking at this, there is real high importance on the diligence of keeping what God's law says, particularly with this Sabbath. But we see that played out with Ezra and as a teacher holding to the specifics of what has been commanded to them and upholding them.
All right. And finally, a good deal of attention is given here at the end of Ezra to intermarriage in the land of Judah. So why is intermarriage such a significant topic? Is this a cultural thing? Is this a racial thing? Like, what's going on?
Well, speaking to is it a racial thing? I think we've plenty of warrant so far as we've read through the Torah that this is not to do with race. When you see people like Ruth and Rahab being grafted into the family and being being part of the lineage of David and one day to be the lineage of Christ, the emphasis is not on the fact that they are a different race. The emphasis is that they're coming from a different culture with different gods. I mean, if you look at King Solomon, what was his downfall? What led him to bring about the problems in the kingdom that eventually divided the kingdom and led to all that sin? His hearts were torn away from Yahweh. His heart was torn away from all of these wives that had all of these different religions that he wanted to build different statues to on the high places and different idols. I mean, Ezra comes in specifically emphasizing how he wants to teach the law of Moses, and Moses himself married a Midianite woman. So it's not to do with race. It has to do with the danger of marrying into these families and forgetting the law of God that they're supposed to be teaching to their households.
And that's a recurring theme, even from the very beginning when all of that was instituted, even when they went into the land. I mean, why was it that they were told to eradicate the people from the land? It was for this very reason, so that they would not intermingle with them in marriage and ultimately take their gods to be their gods, which is what happened. That is why one of the large reasons why they were deported was because of the idolatry, that they went after other gods, including the example of Solomon that we just heard. And so as we come to the end of Ezra, sadly, they're doing the very same things again that they were punished for to start with. They were deported because they'd lost their heart for God and gone after other gods. And now they finally come back after all these years. And quickly, I mean, from our standpoint, again, it has been decades, but rather quickly, they're back doing the same things they had done before. And so it is, and we have to make this very clear, it is a religious thing. It is not racial. I wouldn't even call it cultural. I would simply call it a religious issue that even as we're told in the New Testament, that a believer is not to have a union with an unbeliever because it tears our heart away from God. And so we see the same thing in the New Testament.
So in looking at the solution to this evil that they've committed and abandoning the commitments that they were supposed to have to keep their families in faithful service to Yahweh, and they've married into these other religions that are in danger of pulling away their heart and their faith, we get a really messy solution. One of the things that Alan was talking about before we started, he said it's kind of like, the better of two evils. It's divorce isn't a good thing, but rather than them having to take these families and be completely removed from God's presence in Jerusalem and be in danger of even being judged by God and by the community, Ezra is convinced to enact this mass divorce, like 100 men divorcing their wives and putting away their children. And it's really not, somebody's life verse. It's not a beautiful, picture of that we like to tell in Sunday school, but it's emphasizing the seriousness of the sin that was going on when Ezra came back into their community. And one of the things I want to emphasize as we talk through Ezra and Nehemiah is this is kind of the theme of this once unified book that we've now broken into two different books. Is there's this anticlimax, this it doesn't really end on a high note to each of these stories. With Zerubbabel, they finished the construction of the temple, and if you're remembering back to when the tabernacle was finished, or when you're remembering back to when the Temple of Solomon were finished, you might be expecting this grand, huge ceremony where the glory of God enters into the temple like a fire, and it kind of just ends on a low note. They just celebrate the Passover, which is important, but it's not what you would expect if you think back. And now with Ezra, he's come in, he set his heart to teach the law and to do it and to bring it back into the community, and his story kind of ends with a list of men who divorced their wives and left their children. And so I think one of the things that we should see as we go into this text is that this is not the final solution. When the prophets have prophesied that he's going to set his son on Zion, his holy hill, when he's prophesied that the walls of Jerusalem will be a place for people to come in safety and worship God, they're not emphasizing here only the political, return from exile. The spiritual decay that has taken place in their hearts can still only be fixed when the heart of stone has been removed and a heart of flesh has been put in. And even when we go to Nehemiah next week, I think we're going to continue to see some of that anticlimax at the end of each story.
I think it's also a reminder of what what Taylor said a moment ago, and that is Ezra is elevating the law. And so what we see in these last two chapters, really the last chapter, is difficult, but it's a result of Ezra's commitment to the law of God. They've read it. They now see that, hey, we're not supposed to have done this, and therefore they're correcting it. Now, again, we would have problems with maybe the way they corrected it, because we know that Malachi says God hates divorce, among others. And so we might have struggles with how he corrected it, but the fact is he's elevating the law and demonstrating their obedience to it, even when it's costly.
Mm-hmm. And it hurts him, right? In 9, I believe it is, verse 5, 6, he says, I rose from my fasting with my garment and my cloak torn. I fell upon my knees and spread out my hands to the Lord, saying, Oh, my God, I am ashamed and blush to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens. So, I mean, he's stricken with just utter guilt of, the deepness of the sin that they've allowed themselves to come into. But anyways, I believe that's it for Ezra. So if, like I say every week, if we have questions, we have an email. It's the Bible Connection bdbc@gmail.com, and you can send your questions there, or you can simply leave a comment here on the YouTube video. Or if you see us in church, feel free to come up to us. We love the interaction. We just want to know how to make this podcast suit you better. So that's it for episode 20, and we'll see you on episode 21.